Thank you for coming to Get Your Mind into the Gutter, teaching graphic novels with Hannah Nolan-Spohn, an English language support teacher at Lincoln Middle School in Berwyn North District 98. Hannah was formerly a special education teacher in CPS and is a former RLTA recipient and RLTA Summer Institute Facilitator, and did a version of this workshop for teachers this past summer that was really, really well received. So we're so excited to have Hannah with us here today.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you all for being here. So yes, I am Hannah Nolan-Spohn. I am now an English language teacher in Berwyn and was in CPS for 11 years before that. And just a little bit about how I came to this topic was, as a special education teacher, I noticed that a lot of my students were drawn to reading graphic novels. And I did have that bias, which I think Annie brought up, this whole thing about them not being real books. When I first started teaching, I was like, ooh, that's too easy. Let's read a real book. And so I learned that, of course, they are real books. They're just not text-only books. But what I kind of had a hypothesis that my students weren't maybe making as much meaning from them as they could, because I noticed they would flip the pages very quickly. And so that got me interested in kind of looking into what does it take to really get a lot out of a graphic novel. And so I started studying it. And these are two of the kind of mentor texts that I have used to help me understand more about comics and graphic novels. Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud is fabulous, and it is written in the form of a graphic novel. So I highly recommend that one. And then Will Eisner's kind of like the guru of comics, kind of like from years ago, he's passed away. So this is a little bit more about kind of unpacking the choices that authors make when they're creating comics and graphic novels. Anyway, I ended up teaching graphic novels to my students. I ended up running a study group through the Chicago Foundation for Education, and then presenting at their workshop and through WITS a couple of times as well. So or RLTA, I'm really passionate about this topic and happy to be sharing it with you today. So just a little disclaimer. Sometimes people refer to graphic novels as a genre, and it is not a genre, it's a medium, right? It's a form of a book, but it's not. Just because a kid likes a specific graphic novel doesn't mean that all graphic novels are going to be for that kid, right? There's fantasy, there's realistic fiction, there's nonfiction, there's horror, there's some very adult themes in some graphic novels, right? So like, it's not a medium, or it is a medium, it's not a genre, and knowing kind of what the students are interested in can help you guide them towards a graphic novel that they will actually enjoy. So just a reminder that there are graphic novels on Epic. This is from a series called Lumberjanes, which I love. It's a fabulous series. It's kind of like a fantasy, girls camp adventure. It's a wonderful series. And my middle schoolers ate it up. So that one's available as well as many others. If you could take a moment now, if you are having access to Epic, you could search for a graphic novel, just to have that open as an example. We will be doing some practice. But along the way, I'll also have PDFs available that Ellen can drop into the chat. So if you decide you don't want to work through Epic today, that's fine. And then just as a reminder that on Epic, when you're reading a graphic novel, there is this zoom in feature. So if you see, it's kind of highlighted on the screenshot, which can be really helpful for digging in deeper into details, which we're going to talk a lot about in this session. So here's a little overview of what we'll be doing today. Basically, I'm going to be teaching you a set of lessons like I would teach to students about the vocabulary of graphic novels, about how we read bodies, about how film techniques are used, and then we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A. So along the way, like I said, you will have a chance to practice. If you happen to have a hard copy graphic novel and you prefer to use that, feel free to grab that. Otherwise, if you can either open up one on Epic or just be prepared to open one of the PDFs that Ellen will put in the chat as we go along. Before I move on, Ellen, is there anything coming up in the chat that we need to address?
No, some great responses, but no specific questions.
No issues. Okay, great.
No
so yeah, if any
yeah.
kind of tech stuff comes up, just let me know and we could pause. Okay, so let's get into it. So First off, when we talk about the vocabulary of graphic novels, the first thing I want to talk to you about is panels, right? So panels are shapes. They're typically squares or rectangles that contain a moment. And so we can see on this spread from Pashmina that the panels can be long, they can be tall, they can be different sizes and shapes. And those are all stylistic choices that convey information. So for example, when we see 3 panels that are around the same size in a row, that gives us a sense of like the sequence of time. These things are happening either in rapid succession or maybe even at the same time. Versus on the top right, when we see this large sort of establishing shot, again, that's kind of more the film technique where we're getting a sense of the setting. So all of these choices, and you'll see all different types of frames that artists will use, like bubbles or sketchy lines or dotted lines. And each of those is a conscious choice, right? And so reading the panel and even reading the panel shape is part of understanding what's going on that page. And then the gutter, this is where we get the name of the workshop. The gutter is that space in between the 2 boxes. And this is a little clip from Scott McCloud. He says, see that space between the panels? That's what comic aficionados have named the gutter. And despite its unceremonious title, the gutter plays host to much of the magic and mystery that are at the very heart of comics. So the gutter is the space between the 2 panels. And what we end up doing is making a ton of inferences about what has occurred between the first panel and the second panel. And so that's why I say we want to get our minds into the gutter, because that's where a lot of our thinking is going to happen as we're reading. In graphic novels, we also have a lot of different conventions for talking about speech and sound. So we have dialogue, which is words said out loud by a character. Thoughts are words inside the character's head. Narration are words describing the events that are not said out loud, like third-person narration. And then electronics, which are words coming from a phone, TV, radio, or other electronic device. This is a clip from one of Will Eisner's comics. And I'm wondering if we can get a volunteer to name which part of speech or sound you can see and how you know. Don't be shy. So can somebody tell us, like, what is dialogue and how do you know that it's dialogue in this picture?
It's the bubble is solid and there's an arrow to somebody speaking.
Awesome, Laura. So how do we, that's exactly how we know who's talking, right? Because the tail of that speech bubble is pointing to that person. Thank you. What about thoughts? What are the thoughts on this page and how can we tell?
The thoughts are the ones in the, because we see the bubble and because it's not hard lines like that, we know that it is thought instead of a quote.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Or dialogue.
Right, because we have kind of this convention of this sort of bubbly shape and the little bubbles coming down towards the person. Thank you. What about narration?
That's up on top, the meanwhile at Commissioner DeLon's office.
How can you tell that it's narration?
Because it's saying like the setting.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
yeah, and then even like the
happening.
placement on the page, right? It's at the top of the panel and it's in sort of this box. Thanks, Fran. And then finally for the electronics, can somebody tell us, how can we tell that there's an electronic sound effect happening?
It's
There's the word ring next to
Yeah.
the phone
Right.
in larger text, and two, it's always like this classic comic kind of format where the letters are big, they're not all in a line, so it almost looks like it's like the words in movement almost.
Yeah, absolutely, Annie. Thank you so much. And not being contained within a speech bubble or a thought bubble or a box also gives us this sense of the sound effect. Awesome. So you all just did a lot of work of unpacking what's happening on this page. And these are the kinds of questions you can ask students as you're reading with them. Like, well, who's thinking something on this page? Or what's being said out loud and who's saying it? How can you tell, right? And so these are things that help us understand both the characters, the dialogue, the plot, the setting, all of these elements of the page that aren't being explicitly told to us, right? But we understand the conventions that the comic artists are using And we can interpret that to understand this is narration. And kids are really intuitive with it, right? But once you get them to unpack it, then they're empowered with the language to describe what they're seeing. And then also we want to think a lot about font, right? Because graphic novels are inherently visual genre, or I said genre, inherently visual medium. We want to look at the way that the author uses size and boldness and style. So that can help us infer volume, emotion, emphasis, order of speech, tone. All of these things are choices, and right, we'll see it a lot of times. Certain words will be bolded or larger. Certain types of dialogue will be written in a different font. Certain characters might speak in a certain font. And we want to think about what's the message that's being conveyed by that choice. Okay, so we are going to do a little time for practice. So Ellen, if you can drop this first link into the chat. So either a graphic novel you have on hand, or we've got a couple pages from March book 1, or if you've got one pulled up on Epic, any graphic novel. And I want you to try to identify just one of these 4 things. Do not try to do all 4 at once. So one would be to identify a panel's shape, size, or outline style and interpret its meaning. Your second choice would be to locate a gutter and make an inference about what happened in that space. Or you can find an example of narration, speech, thoughts, or sound effects and explain how you know which one it is. Or locate a change in font size or style and interpret its meaning. So we're going to do about, I would say, 3 minutes of work time on this, and then we're going to share out. So if anyone needs clarification on the directions, please let me know either out loud or in the chat. Otherwise, if you can open up either this excerpt or your own book and take a look for one of these 4 elements. Okay, so if we could possibly get 2 volunteers to share something you noticed. If you want to either raise your hand or just unmute. What's something you found in the graphic novel you were looking at? Go ahead, Fran.
So I chose Sue and the Shadow. And in one of the panels, there's enlarged text that reads whoosh. And the character is holding a jar. And so it is a sound effect, and I know it because it's getting ready to be thrown.
Awesome. Thanks, Fran. Yeah. Could we have one more volunteer share out something you noticed in the excerpt that you looked at?
I chose from the book New Kid, and between classes, there's this long ring, which shows that the students are waiting, or in this panel, they were waiting in between classes, then the bell rings, so they're going to their next class.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Daphne. And so with these 2 examples, we can see that literally every graphic novel you pick up, there's things like this that you can analyze on every single page. And I think one of the challenges is deciding which thing to focus on, because if you talk about every element that you see on every panel, then you're never like going to make progress in the book, and kids actually get frustrated with that. But I would suggest, as you're thinking about how you might incorporate some of this with some of your students, like maybe you just have one focus for the day, and like focus for the day is we're just looking at panels, shapes and sizes. And so as we go through, let's notice and talk about them. Or, maybe we're just going to be talking about dialogue and the way it's arranged on the page. Because yeah, if you try to talk about everything, it's overwhelming. There's so much on each page. Okay, we're going to get into our second topic, which is reading bodies. Okay. So one of the things that's really great about graphic novels is that it draws on kind of our just inherent interest in looking at human faces. One of the things Scott McCloud talks about, that we as humans see faces everywhere, like in electrical outlets and houses and cars and all that stuff. We're drawn to it, right? And so kids have a lot of background knowledge about how people are feeling based on how their face looks. So there's what's said, but then there's also what we see. And so in this panel, this is from Will Eisner, we can see that it's the same word being said, but with different facial expressions, which gives us a sense of a different tone of voice, which makes us imagine maybe a different context and makes us think that the characters may be experiencing a different emotion. So take a look here through each of these rows And if somebody wants to let us know what they think is the difference between maybe, you know, goodbye in the first panel versus goodbye in the second panel, how can you tell what's going on here? Or if you're very brave and you want to say it in the tone of voice you think the character would, you could do that too.
Yes, between the first and second panels, I'm looking at the faces, not just the words. That he seems like he doesn't really care about what he's saying, no matter what it is. And then versus the second face in the second panel, the second column, I suppose, it seems like there's a subtext there with that wink. No matter what he's saying, there's something else going on there.
Right. So you can infer that he doesn't actually mean what he's saying to some extent, right? Like there's some sort of sarcasm or something going on there. Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. And so drawing kids' attention to these little shifts in eyebrows, in eyes, in noses, in mouths, like all of these tiny little details. Again, every one of those is an intentional choice. And it's, when we're reading a text-only novel, the author is going to describe how the character is reacting, and then we can make the inference. And here they're doing the same thing. It's just in a visual format instead of with words. Okay, and then when we also think about gestures and postures and body language, again, we got to draw on our background knowledge about what we signify when we hold our bodies in certain ways. What emotions is the character feeling? What image is the character trying to portray? What actions are happening? So again, this is from Will Eisner. If you look across these rows, is there a particular one that strikes you where you're like, I know what this character is feeling? I know what's happening here. Maybe we could talk about row D. Does somebody want to tell us what emotion do you think is being expressed on row D? Here, I'll get my little spotlight.
When I see like most of all of them in row D, they look kind of stressed, but at the end, almost like the last little person looks pretty content. I don't know, like they're after, I don't know if it's like from beginning to end, but like in the beginning, it's like a stress going through like all those like stressful emotions. And then the last person is like, okay, I got this.
Oh yeah, interesting. Thank you, Felicia. Yes, absolutely. So again, as you're analyzing, we're gonna look at a sample in a minute. And as you're analyzing, be looking for those kind of cues that character is feeling empowered, or that character is feeling afraid, or that character is nervous. Because these are all, again, sort of just in these basic silhouettes, we can get a lot of information about the characters. Okay, so we're going to do another practice. So this time, if you want to use the excerpt that I have, it's from This One Summer, which is a fabulous realistic fiction kind of growing up novel. And or you can use the same one you've been using. And again, we'll do one of the following, just one. Either find a facial expression and make an inference about how that character is feeling, or find a gesture or posture and write the words that would describe it in a text-only novel. What would the author say to make you understand that gesture or posture? And if you notice something in your excerpt related to vocabulary, you can note that as well. Was 3 minutes pretty good work time before? I think if it's not enough, speak up and we can do a little bit more. We're doing fine on time. So we'll go with 3 minutes again. And again, just look for one of these two in the excerpt that you're looking at. Okay, so if we could again have 2 volunteers share, what did you notice about reading bodies in graphic novels?
I can share. I read the PDF this one summer, and it's page 3 on the right. I guess there's a panel that's like a close-up of I think it's Rose, the character's name, and it's like a close-up on Rose's face, and she's like sort of holding tight to her backpack and sort of looking out sort of the side of her, like her eye, and like it looks like her face is like her jaw is really tense and tight, which to me reads that she's scared.
Yeah. And Kristen, was there dialogue in that panel?
No dialogue. in
No
that.
dialogue. Right. And so, Kristen, this is a great example of one of those panels where, because there's no words, a person who's not familiar with reading graphic novels might just look quickly and glance onto the next page, right? But because you know that you should be looking for her facial expression, you're digging in and you're thinking, what's making her tense? What's making her afraid? What is she not saying? Why is she so scared, right? And so you're making all these inferences and coming up with these predictions and theories about this character just from this one panel. So thank you for sharing, Kristen. That's fabulous. Would someone else like to share something you noticed in your excerpt?
I can go. I'm looking at a graphic novel where in between panels, it doesn't really say that the character went to sleep, but it says, in the first panel, it says, "I wonder what you will sing for me today." And in the next panel, there's no text, but the character's laying down with their eyes closed. So you can kind of tell that between the panels in the gutter, they went to sleep.
Fabulous. Right. So you're using, your reading of their body language or the, how their face looks, as well as that inference you made in the gutter. Thanks, Elena. That's awesome. Okay, cool. So we are going to go on to our third sort of lesson about graphic novels. And this is something that I actually learned by presenting, because one of the times I was presenting this, one of the people in the session was like taking a film studies class and started making all these connections. And I was like, oh my God, this is golden. This is so good. So this is something I learned later on, just about how much of the techniques that, directors use to convey information in films is very similar to what's used in graphic novels. So one is thinking about perspective and angle, right? So the perspective of the shot can communicate the point of view, right? Whose point of view are we meant to experience this panel from? But then also the angle of the panel can communicate relationships or emotions. So this is an excerpt from American Born Chinese, which is a really great graphic novel. And so I just want to give everybody a minute to just kind of look at this, and let's talk about some of the things that we see. All right, so whose point of view are we meant to experience these top three panels from? It's okay, you don't know the character's name.
Character sitting down.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And because the other characters are standing up, we get this angle, right? That gives us a sense of intimidation and power. What do you notice about the facial expressions of the boy in the middle on the top three panels?
Doesn't change very much. He's just looking back and forth from the two. Seems like kind of the kid that just goes tags along, doesn't really say much.
Yes, he's the follower, right? And he's ping-ponging back and forth between these two who are sort of arguing, deciding which one he's going to go along with. And the fact that he's placed in the middle and is slightly shorter than the other two, like all of these are letting us know he's the follower, right? What about the font in this top section? What's something that you find interesting about the font? It might be a little blurry or small on your screen, but if we look up at the top right, when he repeats the phrase "little pansy box," it's much smaller, which lets us know that his volume has dropped, because although he was kind of picking on the other boy, we can tell that the boy with the blonde curly hair is the actual leader of this group, right? Like we get this sense of the power dynamic happening. So then let's just think again about the kind of angle and perspective of these last two panels that have no dialogue in them. What does that communicate to you, the way that those panels are framed?
I think it indicates that they're looking at each other, because we get the one top panel from the kid sitting down point of view, understanding that the one is looking back at him.
Yeah.
And then we get the point of view of what he's looking back at, which is the kid sitting down.
And that kid sitting down, what do you notice about that frame?
Oh, he's alone.
He's all alone. Yeah. Yeah. And then I just, again, want to just point out the raised eyebrows on the boy with the blonde hair. If we look at his eyebrows in the top three panels, they're very flat and kind of stern and angry. And suddenly they're softer. right? And so we get this sense that like maybe there's another emotion that he's experiencing that he's not sharing. Maybe he might have some empathy for this child who's all alone. Okay, so then let's also talk about color and shading, right? So a lot of graphic novels will just be kind of in one color palette. Some are full color all the way through, some are black and white all the way through. But then there's some that change, right? And so Pashmina is a great example. Again, this is the clip we looked at the beginning. It's mostly in black and white or grayscale. And then there are certain panels and certain sections that go into full color. And that kind of lets us know that we're in this mythological part of the book. There's another graphic novel that I really adore called This Was Our Pact, which is mostly done in tones of blue and purple. And then there's these like shocks of red. And there's always something important about when red is used in that novel. So we just want to think about that, right? When the color is changing, what does that suggest? If most of the book is black and white, why is the author introducing color here? What is this letting us know? And then how can shading show emotion? So this isn't a good example of it, but the PDF that I have does show that there's, you know, ways in which sketchier, lighter shading might show memory, or it might show dreams, or darker shading could give you a sense of foreboding or danger. But either way, it's always intentional, right? And having that conversation with a kid about why do you think the author chose to do this? What does it mean? Can be really rich. So we are going to do one more practice. This will be our last one. Oh, so here we go. This was our pact. I should have remembered that was the example I chose. Anyway, so you'll see some cool things in This Was Our Pact. It's a really great book. So I would like you to either find one or more panels that show different perspectives and make an inference about what the author is trying to show, or find a panel or page that uses color or shading and interpret its meaning. And if you notice things about vocabulary or reading bodies along the way, go ahead and note that. And we'll do another 3 minutes on this, and then we'll share out. Okay, let's do one more share. What's something you noticed either about perspective or color in the excerpt you chose?
In the book that I have the new kid, and the teacher, you see from the perspective, everything else, these are the students' drawings, but you see on the side, if you hold the book there, it's like the thumbs of the teacher who's reading the students' work.
That's awesome. So very simple and subtle, but powerful way to let us know about the perspective. Cool. Thanks, Daphne. Do we have one more person who wants to share something?
Hello. In This Was Our Pact, it moves from blue to red when there's like a dangerous situation.
Yeah, absolutely, Jessica. Thank you. Okay, cool. So I hope that this has been informative. I hope that there's a lot of ideas kind of pinging around about what you might be able to do when working with students reading graphic novels. So I wanted to leave some space at the end for, ooh, that font did not turn out right. Ooh, sorry, I can just fix that real quick. We're just gonna go back to this. What questions do you have, or how will you use this learning with your students? So take a minute to reflect, and then you can just come off of mute or drop some ideas in the chat about kind of what your next steps might be.
I hadn't really considered the use of color in graphic novels in the way that you have described. And when I've read graphic novels with students, or even maybe when I've read them even on my own, and I definitely think it is something I'll pay more attention to, like when certain colors are being used, or if there feels like there's a theme behind color choices, and that's really interesting.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kristen.
I think this was a super helpful session just in understanding, even though there's not necessarily a ton of words on every single page, there's a lot that's intentionally left unsaid. And so I think there's a lot now that, given the questions that you have asked throughout the session, I'll be able to kind of replicate that with the students and use it as great discussion jumping off points. So thank you.
I'm glad to hear that, Katie. Thanks for sharing.
For me, I think the starting with the vocabulary just kind of started to jog my memory a little bit about just how sophisticated graphic novels are, and just that even thinking about like the difference between a thought bubble and a speech bubble, especially with much younger students, maybe they know that, maybe they don't. So just kind of getting back to basics had me thinking a lot about that.
Yeah, making sure that they understand the vocabulary of the medium. Thanks for sharing that, Ellen. In the version of this I do for teachers, there's a whole section on rigor and how we've addressed like all of the literary Common Core standards throughout this session. So it's just something also to keep in mind. I know that you all aren't, teachers necessarily, but you are educators in the sense that you're working with students, right? And so remembering that, there's a lot of rigorous work and thinking being done by the students when they're reading a graphic novel deeply. It's not easier, it's just different. And I have found too that there's ways in which, for example, dyslexic kids really excel in graphic novels. Like I had a student who, when we were reading Pashmina, picked up on the fact that there was a tiny image of this goddess on key pages that like let us know that there was something to do with this sort of like wish curse that had happened, which I had not noticed at all, right? But because like the way that his dyslexic brain is wired to look for visual patterns, it was very natural for him. Whereas sometimes you might find that some of your students who are really great at reading text-only books really struggle with graphic novels because they're not used to having to process visual information that way. And so it can be both a support and a challenge, depending on how you use it. We definitely have time for a couple more folks to share out any thoughts, ideas, or questions. We can also end early, that's not a problem. But I will stick around for anyone who wants to chat. So yeah, let me pause for a second if there's anyone else who wants to share what they're thinking of right now.
I was just gonna say, Hannah, oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, Hannah, that I think I really like what you just pointed out is something I think about when I read with kids that the way you described it will help me talk with volunteers about it. I'm a WITS staff member, just about like the differences of like strengths and understanding that concept that like someone's comprehension is not just only their ability, and which like of course is like comprehension is different than like reading fluency, which we don't have to get too into the weeds with volunteers, but I do think that concept of like certain students will like really be able to like not only comprehend, but like you were saying, like make inferences and like make all of these like kind of higher level like like levels of like understanding of text and stories. Like I'm thinking about that a lot, and how to like quell kind of those things that we were talking about in the beginning of like these aren't easy, or these these are like not actually practicing reading or things like that. And like you said, a lot of students maybe can actually do a lot more high level thinking when they have a medium that they understand better, or that like is more intuitive to them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hannah, I wonder if you have any tips for, you mentioned that sometimes students or people who are less familiar with graphic novels might kind of zip past pages that don't have a lot of text. Do you have any tips for how to kind of encourage students to slow down and do a little bit of what we did today, like looking more closely?
Yeah, I mean, I do think you have to be really explicit with them about like, okay, so I noticed you flipped the page really quickly. Let's go back and look at this panel really closely, because we have to remember when an author is writing a graphic novel, they're putting a ton of visual information on the page. Not all of the information is contained in the thought and speech bubbles, right? And that's different from a text-only book. And I like to always use the phrase text only instead of real book. So if that's helpful for you all. In a text-only book, the words are all of the information. I think it can be helpful sometimes to like, if you're doing this with a group and you want to remind them to go back to visual information, you can use a book that has absolutely no words, like Arrival by Sean Tan. There's a few David Werner books that have absolutely no words. And so picking up one of those they're more like picture book format, but having students talk about what's happening and how they know what's happening, even though there's literally not a single word in the entire book. I think one of the David Warner ones is Flotsam. And I think the other one's called Wednesday, I want to say. Anyway, those are good strategies for helping kids tune into, there's a lot of visual information.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay, well, like I said, I will stick around till 1 o'clock. If anybody has further questions or comments, I'm happy to stay and chat. I thank you all for your participation. Thanks to everybody who volunteered and shared. I really, really appreciate that active participation, and I hope that this has been useful. I think Ellen will send a follow-up email to share out the slides. If you know another volunteer who was planning to attend and couldn't, please feel free to share this with them. The recording will be available too, and then my contact info is all over it. So if you have follow-up questions or thoughts you want to share with me, I'm very open to that. So thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you, Hannah.